Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. It is a very deep pleasure and honor for me to be one of the recipients this year of the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. I'd like to begin by thanking the Executive Committee of the Tyler Prize for choosing both of us this year. I want to express to Dr. Gadgil my deep pleasure in sharing this very prestigious award with you. It's a great honor for me, and I was really, really delighted. Thank you indeed for the lecture that you just gave as well. I'd like to recognize the prescience of John and Alice Tyler for focusing our attention on the environment so many years ago. They were really ahead of their time, and the long history of distinguished laureates that have received this award are really a stellar group of individuals who have individually and collectively really advanced not only the scientific information, but the policies and practices that are so important to the environment. The prize focuses explicitly on the environment. And today, when you say environment to most people, they think disaster. They think doom and gloom. It's a very, very challenging place to be focusing on environmental issues. That's unfortunate, but it is a reflection of the very serious challenges that are facing us. Now, make no mistake, the challenges are, in fact, daunting. The loss of biological diversity, the loss of habitats, pollution, not only nutrient and chemical pollution, but plastic pollution now. With the increased number of people on the planet, increased use of resources per capita and overall. And then we add climate change and ocean acidification on top of that. There are some very, very real challenges. These challenges are important to us because people's health, prosperity, and well-being depend directly on a healthy environment. Healthy land, healthy waters, healthy oceans. And so we have a real conundrum here where our future depends on healthy places, but when we talk about environment, it's often very doom and gloom. When I was a young girl growing up with my sisters in Colorado, we did a lot of hiking and climbing in the Colorado Rockies. And I remember quite vividly one time, one of my Girl Scout leaders, as we were going up a really, really tall peak that we were trying to scale, advised us that it was really important to occasionally turn around and look down and see how far you had come, to give you renewed energy and vigor to scale the next way up. And with that in mind, I think it is important for us to take stock of some of the amazingly good things that are happening in making progress in tackling some of these daunting environmental challenges. Now, nowhere are these challenges nowhere are the challenges greater than in the ocean, which has for a long time been seen as so immense, so bountiful, that we could dump our waste into it endlessly and extract resources from it forever, and it was just inexhaustible. And this concept of oceans as so bountiful, so resilient, that what we did to them didn't matter is very clearly no longer true. But we still tend to think of oceans as, dilution is the solution to pollution. And that there is just an endless amount of bounty we can extract. So with those thoughts of focusing on oceans, focusing on some of the amazingly good things that I believe give us hope for the future, let me dive into my slides and invite you to join me on a focus of the seas, indeed seize the day, and what I believe is really a new emerging vision for healthy oceans and vibrant communities. I'm going to begin by, as I did, really focusing on global challenges, but particularly focus on the role of science in helping us understand what some of those challenges are. And I want to make it clear that I'm talking not just about natural science, but social sciences as well. I'm going to talk about oceans in particular, but fisheries more specifically, because that indeed has been one of the biggest challenges. And then segue to some recent advances, what I call use-inspired science, some new policy mandates that are playing out, some new approaches that are being taken that are being very successful, and new efforts to pair conservation and management. I believe that these collectively are giving us good reason to be hopeful that we can tackle the remaining challenges that are out there. When I was president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, I had the opportunity to give an address at the annual AAAS meetings. The talk that I gave was, this was in 1997, Entering the Century of the Environment, the need for a new social contract for science. And I was suggesting that it was really time for scientists to re-examine their relationship to society and to not just be academic scientists in the ivory tower, but to, in fact, engage more with society, listening to society, learning from society, much as Madhav has described, but also sharing what they know in a much more open, transparent, and humble fashion. This focus on not just publishing in peer-reviewed literature and giving talks at scientific meetings, but engaging more with society is really something that has gained a lot of resonance in the last almost 20 years now. And I'm greatly encouraged by the increasing engagement that we are seeing with scientists, with society. I was unaware of the Donald Stokes's framing when I gave that lecture and wrote the paper that came from it, but I find his insights very compelling. I grew up at a time when scientists were told they had to choose between focusing on basic science or doing applied science. And basic science was really cool. It was pushing the frontiers of science. It was what you got honors and awards for. It was really exciting and it was fun. Applied science often had the connotation of being very routine, cookie cutter, just kind of turning the crank, variations on a theme. And Donald Stokes says that actually there is a third category that he calls use-inspired science, which is absolutely cutting edge, pushing frontiers of knowledge. It's fundamental research, but it is responsive to societal needs. So it's relevant to society. And I think that what we are seeing now is more and more use-inspired science that is neither just blue sky science, which is incredibly important for us to have as well. This is not instead of. But there are more and more scientists that are engaged in really thinking about how do we come up with solutions to some of these grand challenges that are facing society. And what is the new knowledge that we need to make those advances? So I've adopted this language of use-inspired science and find it to be quite compelling. So the grand challenge that I see for science is to help society in a very engaging, two-way fashion meet the very basic needs of humanity in a just fashion while also restoring Earth's life support systems that are so important. This is not an easy task, and we are struggling with various elements of that. I'm going to hone in now on oceans and fisheries because they really encapsulate some of these grand challenges. Fishing is one of the oldest activities that humans have engaged in. It's one of the most important sources of food for people, especially in developing countries. But in recent decades, fishing has been one of the most destructive activities at the global scale as well as the local scale. So it's really important. More than 1 in 7 people rely on fish for their daily protein. It's incredibly important. And again, especially so in many developing countries, where in countries, for example, Indonesia, over 60% of the population get most of their protein from the sea. at just the time when the population growth is increasing very dramatically, we have the amount of food that we are extracting from the oceans has leveled off. And you can see in blue here that leveling off of the total amount of seafood that is extracted from the oceans. So there's an increasing demand and a diminishing supply. And this presents a very serious challenge. Now, many people have focused on food security, the importance of food security for the future. I think we can't really talk about food security in an honest way without thinking about oceans too. It's not just about grains and livestock on land. It's also about food from the ocean. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that aquaculture will be a key part of that food for the future, but only if we do aquaculture right and we have sustainable aquaculture. I'm going to set aquaculture aside for a moment and focus just on fisheries, but remind us that the challenges are sufficiently daunting, but then we add climate change and ocean acidification on top of those other challenges. And those are making oceans warmer, higher, stormier. They have less oxygen, they're more acidic. And so it's not just solving the problems we have today, it's anticipating how fisheries, how ocean ecosystems are going to be changing in light of these and other factors. So again, the challenges are in fact very serious. So what is it that's limiting the supply of wild-caught seafood? Let's just break this down and be a little more systematic about it. One very real factor is that there are no more new places to fish. It used to be that most of the ocean was inaccessible. It was too far away. You couldn't bring fresh fish back before we had refrigeration. Places were too deep. We couldn't access them. So no more new places to fish. Number two, we have unsustainable fishing practices that in fact are destroying the wherewithal to make more fish, if you will. Thirdly, we have unsustainable fishery policies that are not helping, and illegal fishing. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is a huge global problem, not only on the high seas, but in many countries' exclusive economic zones. And that combination is pretty devastating. I'm going to show you an animation that was prepared for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment by a team at University of British Columbia, the Sea Around Us project that was led by Daniel Pauly. And this is an animation that shows through time the changes in where the peak fishing activity happens. You'll note in the lower left-hand corner, there is the date. This starts in 1951 and will go through to 1999. I'm going to start the animation now, and you'll see that you can pick any place on the globe. Fishing in the 50s and 60s was really close to the coastline, and over time, the peak fishing activity has gone farther and farther away from the coast and farther south. So when I say that we have run out of places to fish, we have pretty much exhausted any undiscovered new fisheries. I'm going to let it run again, pick a different spot, and watch the animation again. So this does not mean that what's left behind is a desert. It is significantly depleted that fishermen are moving on to richer grounds. And in some cases, that devastation has not recovered. In other places, it has. So just because we end up with pink doesn't mean that there's nothing out there. The other phenomenon that has happened through time is that not only are we fishing farther and farther away and farther south, but we are fishing deeper and deeper as technology has enabled us to access those places. So the consequence of this has been very dramatic changes in the global fisheries picture. These are data that are provided by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. They show the percentage of stocks in the different categories that FAO uses. And you will notice that in 1950, over 80% of the fisheries were in developing fisheries. They had not yet reached their full potential. The rest of them were in fully exploited status. By the time we get to 1980, 1990, the percentage of developing has gone down dramatically. We have more fully exploited, and then we have overexploited and collapsed fisheries emerging. Now, the hopeful notion is that on the very bottom right-hand corner, you see an increase in some rebuilding that's going on. And so what has happened has been a global series, it's been serial depletion, one stock after another, not just one place after another, but one stock after another. You overexploit it, you move on, you find another one. That's been the history of commercial fishing. So we've had unsustainable fishery policies that are partly driven by the tyranny of the short term. Fishermen are focused on making enough money to pay off their boat loans, to make a living. There's no guarantee for the future, and so there's very strong economic incentive to fish more now. There's also a lack of stewardship incentives and lack for ownership of the solution by fishermen. They are highly constrained by the rules that govern what they can do, where they can do it in some circumstances. And there's insufficient scientific information for a large number of the fishery stocks around the world. And there's very poor compliance and enforcement. Even when there are rules, they often are not obeyed. And finally, much of fishery regulation through time has not taken advantage of information about ecosystem science, evolutionary biology, and genetics. These are pretty broad generalizations. They're not true across the board, but they have all contributed in large part to these challenges. So fishery managers, especially in anything other than small-scale local fisheries, have really put in place a whole series of controls to help manage the fishing activity and to keep it keep it in a fashion that they hoped would be sustainable. So we went from open access, anybody can fish any place, to limited access. And then there are seasonal closures. When things got to be going in a bad direction, then fishery managers would try seasonal closures, gear controls, what kind of gear you can use, when you can fish. Some fisheries in the United States have trip limits, so each boat is limited to how many trips it can take in a season, or how many days at sea, or closed areas completely. So stronger and stronger ratchets to try to control the fishing effort. And fishermen's response to this has, quite understandably, been to get bigger and bigger boats so that in a limited season with limited controls, you can get out there, you can go out faster, you have better gear, you have more technology. There's high grading. If you get stuff that's not so good and you find something better, you throw the bad stuff over and you keep the good stuff. A lot of frustration and a lot of political backlash, because what fishermen have experienced, they know is not really in their long-term interests. And so this has been a very contentious operation for many fishermen, for many governments, especially in Western countries. In addition to that, there is, I mentioned earlier, the illegal fishing, illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. And this is also called black market fishing or pirate fishing. And this is a huge problem. It is estimated to be as much as $23 billion a year, taking seafood away from legitimate fishing operations that would be legal. And is quite destructive, often just vacuums everything up that's there, destroys the habitat, and is often associated with drug trafficking, with human trafficking, and it's a pretty bad situation. So many have said, you know, this is just really, really a bad news story. We're fishing harder and harder for fewer and fewer returns, and indeed that has been what has been seen in many countries around the world. It's not hopeless, and in fact, I think the tide is turning. There are many efforts underway now to fish smarter, not harder. And that effort is becoming more and more clearly sustainable, and we've learned a lot from a lot of different efforts academic scientists, NGOs, government scientists, local communities, fishermen in the lead on this, working together to chart a different course. These recent advances, I think, are real cause for hope. There are science-based policy reforms to end overfishing and to rebuild depleted stocks. There's broader adoption of a different type of fishery management that is rights-based as opposed to common pool fishery management, and I'll say something more about that in a minute. And new, really exciting efforts to combine rights-based approaches with no-take marine reserves. So let me say something about each of those elements because they roll up to a pretty nice package. The US and the EU have really been in the forefront in terms of significant policy reforms that are beginning to bear fruit. The US is the 4th producer of seafood globally and the 3rd importer globally. The EU is the 5th producer and the 1st importer globally. So they're both really important fishing entities. In 2006, the United States passed legislation, Congress passed legislation called the Magnuson-Stevens Act that these were new amendments to the Magnuson-Stevens Act that really set in motion some dramatic changes in the way fisheries are managed in the United States that are now bearing fruit. The EU saw some of the benefits of what the US has done, and in 2013 did a massive reform of their common fishery policy. Both the changes in both of their practices and policies involved two major things. One, a very strong mandate to end overfishing. But it wasn't just words, it wasn't just thou must end overfishing. There was also teeth and timetables. There was a timetable by which something had to be achieved, and there were consequences if you didn't achieve it. So that mandate with teeth and timetables has been critical. In addition, the ecosystem focus was important. There also have been the option, not the mandate, but the option of using rights-based approaches, which give fishermen a stake in the future and a voice. And that combination has really borne fruit. There are two types of fishery management that I need to contrast for you. The typical type of fishery management is a common pool management. So this is often called the race to fish. There are a bunch of fishermen in a fishery. The gun goes off at the beginning of the season, and everybody goes, races, and catches as fast as they can, as much as they can, before the quota for the whole season for everybody is reached. So that's sort of common pool management. In contrast to that, rights-based management approaches, also called catch shares, also called, one type of them are individual transferable quotas, or ITQs. Under a rights-based management, there is a dedicated share of the scientifically determined total catch is allocated to individual fishermen, to communities, to cooperatives, to some kinds of entities, so that they have a guaranteed fraction of the catch, not only this year, but next year, and the next year, and the next year. And that flips the economics on its head. In the first type of fishery management, common pool management, there's no economic incentive for anybody in the fishery to conserve. If I don't catch as many fish as I can, somebody else is going to until the quota is reached. Often the quota is exceeded. There's no, fishermen would like to think about the future, would like to be having healthy fisheries, but there's no incentive for them to do so. Under a rights-based management system, there is a long-term incentive, there's a stewardship incentive, because everyone in the fishery would like to see there be more fish in the ocean, because then they can each catch more, and they each have a fraction of that catch. And so it's in everybody's self-interest to have the fishery be healthy and to have it be well managed, not overfished. So the rights-based fishery management really aligns short and long-term incentives. It aligns conservation and economic incentives. This type of rights-based management has really gained currency since a scientific analysis was published a number of years ago by actually my sister Peggy's husband and one of his colleagues, an economist, so an ecologist and economist, Steve Gaines and Chris Costello, and one of the graduate students, John Lynham, at UC Santa Barbara at the Bren School. And what they did was to analyze all the fisheries around the world for which there were data. And let's look first at the red line that's on this figure. These are the fisheries that, this is the percent of fisheries that are collapsed through time. And you can see that there are more and more global fisheries that are collapsing. And the dark blue line, I mean the light blue line is where rights-based management approaches started to come into popularity. And you can see that in the 80s, all of a sudden there were more and more rights-based approaches. And then the purple line are those fisheries that had been on the same downward path because they were common pool fisheries that were then converted to, in this case, ITQ, some kind of rights-based management system, and they have stabilized. So a very distinct difference between that and what other fisheries were doing. So this science-based evidence analysis of global patterns really gave a lot of, stirred up a lot of interest in adopting rights-based practices. And in fact, this shows a map of where the rights-based fisheries are today. There are more than 200 rights-based fisheries around the world in representing over 500 species and in 40 countries. And the size of the blob there gives you a sense of the number of species in each country that is under a rights-based system. So you can't read the countries on the right, but you can see that you can see them on the map. In the United States, the experience that we've had, and this was a very personal experience for me because I was at NOAA as the head of NOAA, which has responsibility for managing federal fisheries in U.S. waters. I was there from 2009 to 2013, so much of my time there was really consumed with implementing these tough laws that were passed in 2006. But you know, typically the way Congress does things is if something is going to be hard, you make it easy the first few years, and then it gets harder and harder and harder as the clock is ticking where you have to get something done. And for this particular Fishery Management Act, the easy days were the first. And then when it happened to coincide with when I was at NOAA, those are the really tough years that we had to implement these teeth and timetables and transfer and use more of the rights-based fisheries management. So I'm going to give you some data. These will be comparing the year 2000 to the year 2014. Which are the most recent data. In 2000, there were 92 overfished stocks in the United States. And by 2014, that had been reduced quite significantly to only 37. So ending overfishing is possible. And many have said it's not possible. It's too hard. It is hard. And fishermen did have to sacrifice to have this happen. But it is working. And not only is the number of stocks that are being overfished plummeting, but the number of stocks that are being rebuilt so that they can be fished again at a sustainable level has increased dramatically. In the year 2000, there were 0 stocks that had been rebuilt, so had been crashed so that they were in really bad shape, and then have been rebuilt to the stage where they can be fished on a sustainable basis. And now we have 37 such stocks. So this is an amazing turnaround story. We talked about how we had turned the corner in ending overfishing. We haven't completely ended overfishing. We've turned the corner and are on a much better trajectory than was the case before. And again, this is because of a lot of hard work by a lot of people. The other thing that has happened in that period of time is the increased number of rights-based fishery programs in the United States. In the year 2000, there were only 6 of these. The classic case was the halibut fishery in Alaska. That was an ITQ fishery, turned around, very successful, both sustainable and economically profitable. By 2014, there were 18 rights-based plans in the United States, and the number of unique stocks in each of those plans. Some of those plans have lots of fisheries. So for example, on the West Coast, groundfish fishery, so off the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington, one of the biggest fisheries that we have. The West Coast groundfish fishery in 2011 came under a catch share plan, and that has completely turned that fishery around. So this is really an amazing story, and this is partly what inspired the European Union to say, hey, maybe we should be following this path. I mentioned the US Pacific groundfish fishery and the fishery reforms that happened here. This fishery was in such dire straits, it was declared a federal fishery disaster in the year 2000. It was really in bad shape. In 2011, this new rights-based catch share program was put into place. Highly controversial, highly contentious. It has turned this fishery around. There's been a reduction in the accidental catch of the most vulnerable species. So this is bycatch, stuff that they didn't mean to be catching, but it was really problematic. So that's been cut by 2/3, which is very impressive. Now 13 of the species of groundfish are certified by Marine Stewardship Council, an independent third-party certifier. So these are sustainable. And the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch Program that is also a third-party independent rater of what is sustainable seafood. There are 40 species now of groundfish that are labeled either best choice or good alternative. So this fishery is really a poster child for what can happen to return a fishery to profitability and sustainability. And it's pretty exciting, pretty remarkable. Many of the changes that I've described are also happening in developing countries. Belize is a country where there have been some very important turnarounds. This is still a work in progress. You never completely end overfishing. It's always, you need to keep doing it. But the shallow water reef fisheries in Belize have been seriously threatened by overfishing and illegal fishing in areas that had been designated as no-take areas. More and more difficult for individual fishermen to make a living. But by 2011, the local fishing communities partnered with scientists, with government, and with NGOs to implement a different type of rights-based fishery management called a TURF, Territorial User Right Fishery, where people have specific areas that they have unique access to. And that, in fact, is turning this around. Illegal fishing has decreased just dramatically. 90% reporting for catches, so fishermen are participating in the system and keeping track better. Successive pilot approaches has led to the decision to expand these pilot programs to the entire coastline of Belize because it has been so successful. And it's really empowered fishermen to go from just being the recipients of government policy to being full participants in helping to chart their future. And so it's very much, again, a partnership. And this, these successes, I think, are very encouraging. In parallel to fishery reforms in the oceans, we've seen serious attention to creating no-take areas, areas of the ocean that are fully protected from any destructive or extractive activities. And those conservation areas have been very, very important in protecting biodiversity, protecting habitats, serving as the refugia, not unlike the forest refugia that Madhav was describing to us. So these no-take marine reserves, of which there are hundreds around the world, really also provide hope for protecting health and resilient oceans and biodiversity. And we know from analyses of these protected areas, the no-take ones, that in fact they bring huge benefit. You stop fishing in an area, bounty returns. This figure shows the global averages all around the world, the percent changes. The first figure is for biomass, so over 400% increase in biomass, lots more stuff in an area. The density is much more abundant, 166% increase on average. The individual size, things get bigger, the individual fish are bigger, and diversity also increases quite significantly. So lots of benefit when you don't fish. That actually makes a lot of sense, but we've got concrete information to demonstrate that that's the case. Despite that, and despite the evidence that we have that some of that bounty spills over to the adjacent waters outside that are fished, there is far less than 1% of the global ocean that is protected in no-take areas. And this is in striking contrast to the land, where we have anywhere between 10% and 15%, depending on how you count it, of the land area that is set aside in protected categories. So there's a very stark difference between how we're thinking about protection on land and in the oceans. Not surprisingly, the biggest, the noisiest voices for not creating protected areas in the ocean are fishermen who stand to lose fishing grounds and other extractive users, oil and gas, minerals, mining of one sort or another. But we are seeing a new vision emerge that recognizes blue parks as equal to green parks. And as we are looking ahead to the centennial next year of the National Park Service in the United States, I think you will be seeing not only many celebrations of national parks on land, but also thinking, using that as an opportunity to talk about the importance of parks in general, but parks in the ocean in particular. And I would note that last summer, President Obama created what at the time was the largest network of strongly protected areas in the world. That size has now been eclipsed by the designation by the United Kingdom just last month of the areas around the Pitcairn Islands. So we are seeing a number of very, very large open ocean protected areas, but it is still a drop in the bucket compared to the size of the ocean. So given that rights-based fishery management promotes long-term stewardship and ecological and economic gains, and that these marine reserves provide spillover benefits, it's really natural to ask whether their combination achieves some kind of synergistic benefits. And we're seeing the emergence now of more holistic approaches to ocean management that are combining rights-based fisheries and marine reserves. And this is being done through an effort called Fish Forever, a project that is led jointly by RARE, by Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, and by scientists at University of California at Santa Barbara, Steve Gaines and Chris Costello that I mentioned earlier. And this Fish Forever project is a very innovative new way of thinking about combining these different tools that have been used differently by completely different communities. They're building on the experiences in Belize, taking those to the next scale, looking at Brazil, Mozambique, Philippines, and Indonesia are other places where some of these new innovations are underway. And the focus here is to really fish smarter, not harder, and to introduce these rights-based approaches using territorial user rights fisheries, TERFs, along with working with local communities to develop culturally appropriate management techniques that are embraced by the community, that are co-designed by the community, but take advantage of many of these lessons learned from around the world. So it's grounded in science, it is holistic, there are science-based limits that are at play here. Teeth and timetables are part of the focus here. Partnerships is very much a part of it, but empowering and incentivizing fishermen and communities to turn things around. So in summary, what we've seen in oceans, in addition to many of the major challenges that are out there, is the emergence of new use-inspired interdisciplinary science, where scientists are really, instead of saying, those problems are too big, we can't do them, tackling really, really challenging, societally important problems and making some very concerted advances because they are teaming up with local communities. Engaged scientists are partnering with communities, they're partnering with industry, government, and NGOs. And I think this is really providing hope for people around the world who depend on oceans for their food and livelihood, as well as for the rest of us that depend on healthy oceans more broadly. So we're seeing a powerful key to changing behavior and attitudes in management, and that is changing the incentives of the individuals so that there is some immediate benefit to them. They have a stake in the future, so it's not just short-term tyranny of the present, but the long-term stake. And finding ways to align those short-term and long-term incentives is really key. Doing this also can provide hope that some of the destruction that has happened can be reversed. That's not always the case. We're not seeing cod come back in the North Atlantic, for example, but there are remarkable recoveries that have happened. So one of the keys here is to make these changes before it is too late. No doubt about it, immense challenges remain, especially in light of climate change and ocean acidification. But I think that these recent successes that we've seen, both in terms of commercial scale fisheries as well as small scale fisheries in developed countries and developing countries, are really providing a sense of hope to combine with the sense of urgency that exists. So the hope here is that we can recover the bounty and we can use it wisely, have more fish in the ocean, more seafood on plates, more profitable businesses, and healthier communities. And it's been a pleasure to share some of this good news story with all of you. And I want to give credit to many of my collaborators and partners whose stories I've been telling, because it's really been a labor of love for a large number of people involved in these efforts around the world. Thanks for your attention.